One of the world's most famous airline captains announced he's living with Alzheimer's disease. Captain Sully Sullenberger recently revealed his diagnosis.
For more than 15 years, one name has stood for a single unforgettable moment. A pilot who turned a doomed flight into the safest possible outcome, and whose calm under pressure became a kind of shorthand for grace in a crisis. Captain Chesley Sullenberger never asked for fame that followed him home from the Hudson River. Yet he spent the years afterward using it to make flying safer for everyone else. Now, at 75, he has stepped forward again, this time not to explain a miracle, but to talk plainly about something much harder, growing older, and facing a diagnosis that will change the rest of his life. This is a story of how a farm boy from Texas became the most trusted pilot in America, and why his newest act of honesty might be the most quietly courageous thing he has ever done. Chesley Burnett Sullenberger III was born on January 23, 1951, in Denison, a small city in North Texas. His family traced its roots back generations to Swiss-German settlers, and he grew up as the only son in a household that prized quiet discipline over noise or showmanship. He had one younger sister, Mary, and the two of them were raised with the kind of steady, unglamorous values that rarely make headlines but often shape the people who later do something extraordinary. As a child, Sullenberger built model airplanes and aircraft carriers, and he later said that watching military jets thunder overhead from a nearby Air Force base was what first planted the idea of flight in his mind. He was, by any account, an exceptional student. He ranked near the top of his class in nearly every subject, and by the time he was 11 years old, his test scores were strong enough to qualify him for Mensa. In high school, he led the Latin Club, played flute, and graduated close to the top of a class of roughly 350 students. But it was outside the classroom where his real passion showed itself. He earned his glider license at just 14, and by 16 he was flying a small single-engine plane out of a private airstrip near his family's home. Long before he ever wore a uniform, Sullenberger already understood what it meant to be trusted with something as unforgiving as an aircraft. That early passion carried him into the United States Air Force Academy, where he was accepted into a competitive glider training program for cadets. By his second year, he was already serving as an instructor for other students, an unusually early responsibility that hinted at the career to come. When he graduated, he received the Academy's top honor in airmanship, recognizing him as the best pilot in his class. The Air Force then sent him to Purdue University, where he earned a master's degree in industrial and organizational psychology, a field of study that would quietly shape how he thought about human behavior under stress for the rest of his life. He went on to fly the F-4 Phantom fighter jet, serving with squadrons in England, Nevada, and rising to the rank of captain. During those years, he also sat on boards investigating aircraft accidents, building an expertise in failure and error that most pilots never touch. By 1980, Sullenberger had left the military and moved into commercial aviation, eventually landing with U.S. Airways and the airlines that came before it. Over the next 3 decades, he logged tens of thousands of flight hours. But flying was never his only job. He worked as a flight instructor, an investigator for the National Transportation Safety Board, and a safety leader within the pilots' union, helping shape procedures that airlines still use today. He played a key role in developing crew training programs focused on communication and decision-making in emergencies, a curriculum he personally taught to hundreds of fellow crew members. In 2007, he founded a safety consulting firm aimed at helping high-risk industries, from hospitals to factories, reduce the kind of human error that can turn a small mistake into a catastrophe. Few of the passengers who boarded his flights over the years had any idea that the calm voice welcoming them aboard belonged to a man who had spent his entire adult life studying exactly what goes wrong in a cockpit and how a well-trained crew brings people home anyway. On January 15, 2009, Sullenberger was in command of U.S. Airways Flight 1549, an Airbus A320 climbing out of LaGuardia Airport bound for Charlotte, North Carolina. Less than 2 minutes after takeoff, the plane flew directly into a flock of Canada geese, and both engines lost power almost simultaneously. Suddenly, Sullenberger and his first officer, Jeffrey Skiles, were gliding a powerless jet over one of the most densely populated cities in the world. Air traffic controllers offered him the chance to turn back to LaGuardia or divert to a nearby airport in New Jersey, But Sullenberger quickly calculated that neither runway was within reach. Instead, he made a decision to bring the plane down on the Hudson River. What followed became one of the most closely studied emergency landings in aviation history. Sullenberger later admitted that the silence of the engines cutting out was one of the most shocking sounds he had ever heard, and that the seconds before touchdown brought a wave of fear unlike anything in his career. Even so, the landing was smooth enough that the aircraft stayed intact on the water, giving. All 155 people aboard time to climb onto the wings and into rescue boats that reached them within minutes. Sullenberger walked the length of the cabin twice to make sure it was empty before he became the last person to leave the sinking plane. Investigators later confirmed that ditching in the river was the right call, since standard emergency procedures are built around engine failure at cruising altitude, not seconds after takeoff, and any attempt to turn back risked coming down in a crowded neighborhood. New York's mayor nicknamed him Captain Cool for his composure, though Sullenberger has since said that the calm exterior hid real fear and that he struggled with symptoms resembling post-traumatic stress for weeks afterward, including sleeplessness and flashbacks. Even the people we call heroes, it turns out, carry the weight of what almost happened. Recognition poured in from every direction. The sitting president called to thank him personally. The incoming president invited the entire crew to his inauguration days later, and Congress passed formal resolutions honoring the crew and the first responders who pulled passengers from the icy water. New York City gave him a key to the city. His hometown made him an honorary police officer, and he was named one of the most influential people of the year by a national magazine. Weeks later, the crew received a standing ovation during the Super Bowl pregame ceremony, a moment that showed just how far their story had traveled beyond aviation circles. None of it would have been possible without the ferry operators and tugboat crews who reached the sinking aircraft within minutes. Pulling passengers from the wings and the freezing water before hypothermia could set in, investigators later said their speed was essential to the fact that not a single life was lost that day. The plane itself was eventually recovered from the river and now sits on permanent display at a Charlotte Aviation museum that was renamed in his honor, keeping the story accessible to visitors who weren't yet born when it happened. For a man his friends have long described as shy and reserved, the sudden wave of global attention was almost as disorienting as the crash itself. Rather than fade from public life once the headlines slowed, Sullenberger spent the next decade turning unexpected fame into a genuine second career built on education and advocacy. He kept flying commercially until 2010, retiring after 30 years with a final flight from Fort Lauderdale to Charlotte alongside Skiles and several passengers from that January flight. That same year, France awarded him one of its highest honors, and he served as Grand Marshal of the Tournament of Roses Parade, a clear sign that he had shifted from working pilot to public figure. In 2009, he partnered with journalist Jeffrey Zaslow to write a best-selling memoir that went far beyond the Hudson landing, opening up about his father's death by suicide in 1995 and the private grief that followed. That disclosure later turned Sullenberger into an outspoken advocate for suicide prevention awareness. The book became the basis for a major 2016 film directed by Clint Eastwood, introducing his story to a generation who hadn't lived through it firsthand. He followed the memoir with a second book focused on leadership, further cementing his reputation as a voice on courage under pressure rather than simply a pilot who got lucky once. Between 2009 and 2013, Sullenberger and Skiles partnered on a youth aviation program designed to introduce free introductory flights to young people, encouraging a new generation to consider careers in aviation. Their work earned them one of the field's most prestigious awards, recognizing both their heroism on Flight 1549 and their lasting impact on the future of flight. His expertise also made him a fixture in national media. In 2011, a major news network named him its aviation and safety analyst, a role in which he explained complicated aviation incidents to millions of viewers whenever a major story broke. That same year, he addressed world leaders and executives at the World Economic Forum in Davos, sharing lessons on crisis leadership and decision-making under extreme pressure. His continued contributions earned him several major industry honors over the following years, recognizing both his aviation expertise and his public communication. Sullenberger also became one of aviation's most persistent watchdogs. After the Boeing 737 MAX crashes, he publicly criticized the manufacturer and federal regulators, testified before Congress that the disaster should never have happened, and pointing to what he described as a broken relationship between aircraft makers and the agencies meant to oversee them. He kept raising similar concerns years later when new regulators hesitated to commit to existing pilot training standards. In 2021, President Biden nominated him to serve as United States Ambassador to the International Civil Aviation Organization, a Senate-confirmed role that placed a former airline captain at the center of global conversations about flight safety. He presented his credentials in Montreal in early 2022 and served through that summer, capping a remarkable transformation from regional pilot to international aviation statesman. Away from the spotlight, his home life stayed steady. He married fitness instructor Lori Henry in 1989, and the couple settled in Danville, California, where they adopted 2 daughters, Kate and Kelly. Friends have long said that the contrast between his public composure and his ordinary evenings spent on homework and family dinners is central to who he really is. In mid-July of 2026, Sullenberger shared news that reframed how the public understands this chapter of his life. In a personal statement, he explained that he had recently been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's disease after noticing subtle changes in his own memory, including trouble recalling names, repeating stories, and disrupted sleep. He described himself as being at the very beginning of a long journey, choosing plain, direct language over anything dramatic, in much the same way he once described the technical details of the Hudson landing rather than dressing it up for effect. He shared that he has been working with a specialist at UCSF Medical Center in San Francisco, and that his doctor helped him understand just how widespread Alzheimer's really is, affecting millions of families regardless of age. Sullenberger said he had long believed that courage can be contagious, an idea he often repeated when people asked him about Flight 1549, and he said the same idea now applies to facing this disease openly rather than in private. He framed his decision to speak publicly as a way to spare other families some of the isolation that so often comes with a diagnosis like this, saying he now considers himself part of a much larger community, moving forward together. His wife Lori also spoke about the news, describing him as the same steady presence he has always been, both before and after the Hudson landing, and now again facing this new challenge. She said that steadiness continues to guide the family as they adjust to what lies ahead, and that even with an uncertain future, they intend to keep living fully and finding joy in ordinary moments. Medical experts note that there is currently no cure for Alzheimer's disease, and that symptoms typically progress over time even when they begin mildly, though improved detection tools and newer treatment options have given many recently diagnosed patients more choices than were available in past decades. Longtime colleagues point out that this isn't the first time Sullenberger has chosen transparency over comfort. He was similarly open years earlier about struggling with symptoms resembling post-traumatic stress after the Hudson landing, and about the grief that followed his father's suicide, both disclosures that helped normalize conversations many public figures still avoid. In telling this latest story in his own plain words, he kept the same measured tone that once helped calm an entire cabin of frightened passengers thousands of feet above the Hudson River. Alzheimer's disease touches millions of families across the country, and when public figures speak openly about an early diagnosis, it often helps push the condition out of the shadows and into everyday conversation. Sullenberger's willingness to name his doctor and describe his own symptoms in detail reflects the same trust and expertise that guided him through decades of technical safety work. His statement made clear that he does not see the diagnosis as a reason to withdraw from public life, but as a new chapter in which the same discipline that once defined his flying career can now support his family and community through what he openly called a long and uncertain road. For a man whose public identity was built around a single afternoon of extraordinary calm, this latest disclosure feels less like an ending and more like a continuation of the same instinct that guided him on January 15th, 2009. He is choosing once again to face a difficult moment in full view rather than turn away from it, trusting that his honesty will help other families dealing with the same diagnosis feel a little less alone. Those close to the family, say his daughters Kate and Kelly, have rallied around their father in the weeks since the news became public, describing a household that has always leaned on routine and honesty during hard moments, Going back to the years when Sullenberger balanced a demanding airline schedule with ordinary family life in Danville. Rather than retreating from public view, he has continued to grant interviews and issue statements in his own words, choosing to remain the primary voice of his own story rather than letting others tell it for him. That choice echoes the same instinct that once made him walk the aisle of a sinking aircraft twice before he would allow himself to leave, making sure everyone else was accounted for before he considered his own safety. From a Texas boy who built model planes to a fighter pilot, an airline captain, a best-selling author, a congressional witness, an ambassador, and now an advocate speaking candidly about Alzheimer's, Sullenberger's life reads as one long, continuous story about showing up fully for the people counting on him. Whatever the coming years bring, the people who know him best believe that same instinct, to look after others before himself, isn't likely to change now. It carried 155 people safely out of an icy river once. There's no reason to think it won't carry him, and the people who love him, through whatever comes next.